Thanks, Jack. From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow. I couldn't help doing that. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Kay Weltz. I'm still fairly new to the CEC. I only joined the team in January this year. I'm a Conservation Project Manager and the Research Operations Manager for CEC. Before I dive into the presentation, I would like to acknowledge my respects of the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today and pay my respects to emerging past, present and future elders. And today I'd like to just give a brief talk on a project, one of the projects I've been working on with my colleague James, looking at ecological baselines and how these are going to shape a shared vision for Cape Otway's vegetation and wildlife. So the study area is outlined by this blue line on Cape Otway, and what we can also see here is some of the most recent fire history of the area. And as you can see, there was a large bushfire here in the 1960s, another bushfire in the 1990s, a small private burn in 2020, and a planned burn in 2021. And this is the extent of our fire history in this area. Our project focuses mainly on the biodiversity exclusion area here on Cape Otway, which is really a mix of a variety of different ecological vegetation classes, as you can see here, everything from diverse forests, heaths and grasslands. And so Cape Otway's complex vegetation mix really provides an important habitat for vulnerable species such as long-nosed potoroos, swamp antechinus, gang cockatoos, leafy green hood orchids and broadtooth rat species. And these are all declining due to inappropriate fire regimes, predation by invasive species, habitat degradation and climate change. So the vegetation on the Cape also faces a variety of challenges, mainly due to the lack of this fire in the system for many years. We're finding woodlands which are quite bracken dominated. We're finding that there's also a large amount of shrub encroachment from coastal shrubs such as leucopogon. We're also finding that the wet heath has got a lot of woody shrubs such as melaleuca and is quite dense and lacking diversity. And the goal long term is to put fire back into this landscape to really bring it back to a more graminoid-dominated, which is a fancy word for grasses, dominated system below the canopy, which will then also allow these vulnerable species to thrive. So the aims and objectives of this project were to establish a pre-fire baseline for fauna, flora and fungi across the Cape, across those key habitats, and to implement adaptive experimental management where this research will really inform on-ground actions. The long-term goal is to develop a shared vision for the desired states of each of these vegetation types, including a 3-year experimental plan for the vegetation, and compare the management actions against this baseline to evaluate their impact on the flora and fauna and fungi throughout the post-fire monitoring, hopefully. So what was done so far on the project? We deployed 3 baited camera grids across a mix of the EVCs for about 3 to 5 weeks of this summer, and the aim was to detect small native mammals. We also recorded any feral species such as foxes and cats and any other native or non-native wildlife that we captured on camera. And so we had 1 camera grid, 2 camera grids and 3 camera grids across there. We also conducted bird surveys using 2 different methods. So we used the transect method, which follows the BirdLife Australia guidelines, walking a 2-hectare transect at dusk and dawn. We did this 3 times for each of the EVCs, and this is indicated by the yellow lines. We also deployed song meter micros, which is an acoustic recorder, to fill in any missing gaps that we might not have recorded in our transects, and also to trial this equipment for CC. So we have one song meter micro placed in each one of these EVCs. And we recorded 1 hour after dawn and before dusk, and we retrieved after 3 weeks. We also followed the Threatened Species Conservancy guidelines to look at macro snails in the area. We conducted snail surveys at 3 sites within each one of the EVCs, and this is shown by these yellow dots here. We did this using a 60-minute search effort around a point coordinate, around 250-metre circle radius, and we recorded pretty much any snail or slugs that we could find in that area. We did the same for fungi as well, using the same method. Again, record 3 sites per each EVC and recording any fungi that we could find. So what we found, our results so far, is in terms of total native mammal detections, so this is the detections on this axis and all the different species that we detected on our camera grids. We could see bush rats were the largest detection, followed by agile antechinus, which is a mouse, and swamp wallabies. And then interestingly, long-nosed potoroos and long-nosed bandicoots were our 4th and 5th most detected species, which is wonderful. In terms of long-nosed potoroos and long-nosed bandicoots, the long-nosed bandicoots were quite widespread across all 3 of the different camera grids. This graph shows in pink the potoroos and bandicoot detections, in pink, in blue the long-nosed bandicoots, and in purple only the long-nosed potoroos. And as you can see, the long-nosed potoroos were found predominantly in this only in the wet heath mixed complex up here, whereas the long-nosed bandicoots are really quite prolific in the 3rd grid as well. In terms of small mammals overall, the interesting thing to draw away from this is that we found a lot of agile antechinus, swamp antechinus, and swamp rats, which are all mice and rats, a lot in the 3rd grid, which is quite close to all the farmlands, whereas a lot of the more threatened species, such as long-nosed potoroos and long-nosed bandicoots, were actually more found up in this conglomerate mix of vegetations in the wet heath. In terms of foxes and cats, we found quite minimal really, but where we did find them, they were on the edges of the thick wet heath and close to the tracks and roads. However, there were not really enough detections for us to really draw any major conclusions. Cats were only detected in grid 3, and so there really seems to be an avoidance of the actual deep heath of these species. And this quite nicely confirms a lot of our results that we've been finding for the animals that like to avoid them. So we, for our birds, this is the number of birds and these are the different vegetation types. That EVC 8 is actually the wet heath, and we can see quite a large number of birds hiding out in the wet heath away from the cats. So these are a lot of the common species that we found across all EVCs, superb fairy wrens, grey shrike thrush, crimson rosellas, white-throated tree creepers, all the common birds that we see quite frequently on the Cape. In terms of similarity between EVCs, this is a dendrogram showing most similar groupings together. So the coastal EVCs, the damp sand, rich herb woodlands, and the coastal headland shrub closing similar together. And then we have the shrubby foothills forests and the wet heath grouping together, and then the lowland forest types grouping together, so that makes a lot of sense. There was a lot of species that were specific to only one EVC. For example, the rufous bristlebird detected in the coastal EVCs only. We also took note of a lot of the opportunistic birds that we viewed throughout our time conducting all of these surveys and camera grids on the Cape, and we made a note of all these other species that we potentially didn't capture in our transects or song meter micros. In terms of fungi, we found a large number of fungi in the wet heath. Maybe it retains a lot of moisture. The most common species were Mycena and Quaternarians across all EVCs. Again, similar groupings to the birds actually, which is great. Excuse me. And we did also find a lot of fungi specific to certain EVCs. Interestingly, out of 57 genera of fungi that we recorded, only 27 were only found in one EVC. So pretty specific to each EVC, really. In terms of snails, we found 5 different species of snails across all the EVCs, 2 native snails and 3 invasive species. And again, as you can see, some snails are more broadly distributed, such as the semi-slug, which we found pretty much in all of the EVCs, except for the coastal. And some are quite specific to only one EVC, such as this hedgehog slug, which we only found in the damp sand herb-rich woodlands. We also took note of any other species that we came across in our time surveying the Cape. A lot of reptiles. We came across quite a few different snake species. We also came across some really cool butterflies. So what's still to come? We're going to be doing the vegetation surveys this spring, where we're going to be looking at the different vegetation types within each of these EVCs. We're also going to be coming up with a shared vision and a 3-year experimental plan for the Cape. And then hopefully next year, when these burns go ahead on the Cape, we will be able to also monitor for flora, fauna and fungi post-fire. Thank you.